A conversation about space, life, and wanting to be an astronaut or wanting to be a person in space.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks very much.
David, you have a profile, at least in LinkedIn, and I believe it's true as we've been speaking, that is focused on the innovation and on business. And how did you decide that you wanted to do space? Was it?
Yeah, it's either you can either look at it as a blessing or a curse. I'm not exactly sure which. Honestly, the bug caught me when I was in elementary school, and I was lucky enough to have seen the moon landings the very first time, in pajamas, in the basement at 1 a.m. or whatever it was when Neil finally stepped on the moon, and whatever it was that sort of hooked me. So I knew from the very beginning that's what I wanted to do. So honestly, I've pursued that all the way through until today. So again, you can look at it as a blessing or a curse. I'm not quite sure. So that's essentially how I began. The interesting thing is going throughout sort of my career and looking at the things that I've either been able to do or not been able to do, and most especially watching what's been changing in space. It's a huge, no pun intended, leap from the time that it was very elite individuals who were supported by thousands of people were sent up into the great beyond, to what's happening today. So that to me is really exciting. I tend to, I've been lucky enough that, I've had a father and a grandfather that have started some businesses. The one that I remember the most is my grandfather. He started a candy factory, believe it or not, back in Toledo, Ohio in the 1940s. And I still have a picture of it somewhere. But he, in describing that, he didn't talk too much about it, but it went on to become something much larger when one of his partners took it beyond, but he wasn't that interested. But it always struck me that it was really interesting that he basically said, look, if you have some ideas, if you have at least a little bit of drive, a little bit of money, anybody can start a business. And as of today, I gave a talk a couple of years ago, and I looked up where our gross domestic product in the United States lies within numbers of companies. And it's somewhere between 80 to 90% that typically the money that comes into the economy is coming from small businesses. So it's still the lifeblood, if you will. So the thing that I've been the most interested in over the last couple of years is how do we translate that into space?
How do we either break these or fundamentally change it? What? How to do that?
It's a really good question and a really interesting challenge. So honestly, I think part of it is we have to look at what's worked on the terrestrial model, and then address the things, either whether they're technical platforms, whether they're contracting platforms, whether it's funding sources, whatever it might be, to allow it to happen. As you know, here in 2021, the big buzzword, it might have been dying a bit, but it was new space, right? New space. Everybody used that word. Never really understood what that meant, in all honesty. So because it was really interesting, even the big guys eventually, Lockheed Martin and others, would say, well, we're new space. We're getting ready for new space. It's the same old people, right? I think there was a couple of threads that are beginning to come together that are showing great promise in being able to allow, as we've indicated, the common person to be able to get into space and in some way. So let's see, the first thing that we ought to define is, what does it mean to be in space? Well, there's the obvious one, which is you're an astronaut and you're physically there. Yeah. We'll talk about that in a second. But the other one really is, are you in the business supporting things in space? And what's fascinating is, if you look at the Bryce analysis that comes out all the time, there are thousands and tens of thousands and millions of people that are already in space, that they're just on the other end of the data that's coming down. They exist because spacecraft or satellites are up there and providing, whether it's imagery, whether it's internet connectivity, whether it's communication, whatever it might be, right? So that's interesting. So the question then becomes, what is it that we will do in the environment of space to allow more individuals to be working on those things that are working in space, that either are supporting things on the ground, or, as I sort of personally believe, is we're starting to move our gaze out further. Um, so one of the threads that I think got started into this whole nomenclature of new space was the advent of the standard called CubeSat. Beautiful exercise, beautiful, creative concept that was done specifically to teach satellite engineering. That was the original intention of what a CubeSat was. And it was really simply put out at Cal Poly, a 10 centimeter, 10 centimeter, 10 centimeter block, fit everything inside. The interesting thing about it is that most people think that satellites or spacecraft are all pieces of metal. Well, in reality, most of a spacecraft is electronics and software. So a CubeSat really helped sort of describe that. And then it was just a really interesting phenomenon. At the time that CubeSats were created, and they were used for mainly for education, they proliferated into other educational institutions, which again was great. But then they caught the eye of both the commercial sector, but really it was the US government that saw some of the first benefits. And they caught the eye not from the standpoint of, oh, isn't this cool because it's small and little. They caught the eye because it was cheap. They bought into, oh my gosh,
Okay.
students can put together a CubeSat for $15,000 when we're paying billions of dollars for very large space assets in the government, right? So um, that was sort of fascinating. One of the first programs that came out was actually pushed, believe it or not, by the NRO. The NRO had a program, a scientific program, that they were trying to develop the advent of small satellites and get it into, at least inculcate the thinking of the DoD, that you don't have to have big battle stars and pay all this money, right? You can go smaller and you can still do things with small. So they had programs for that at USC, Utah State, a number of other smaller universities actually got benefit of that. And they were seeded to actually build CubeSats where they hadn't done it before, to actually fly it. From that, the most interesting thing is that it showed, and there's a point to this, and coming to sort of the point of the story, is that it began to show the commercial market that, oh wow, interesting, there is a customer potentially interested that likes really small and cheap things that we would like to get into. So the subtext of what honestly started out at the NRO was that they created, this is what I believe, a market. They created the first market for sort of real proliferation of small, lightweight satellites, and the commercial market then saw that, and it began to really grow from that point going forward. So that was, I thought that was, it was brilliant. It was a really good idea that the NRO had. I'm not sure they really saw that they were actually seeding something that would then get into the industry, right? So from that standpoint, that then allowed, in all honesty, individuals or groups of people to say, hey, if a university can build a CubeSat, we could build a CubeSat. So small companies began to proliferate and pop up. The most notable, the most notorious, the one that we know at the moment that really took that to heart was what's now called Planet Labs. So they started originally inside of NASA Ames as a couple of guys in a startup in a garage, literally. And from there, they said, we're just going to launch a whole bunch of those things, do it cheaply, and we're going to be able to look at the Earth. Now, the other interesting thing that happened, so there was the CubeSat insertion, the creation of a potential market. But then there was finally the other thing that happened was the advent of huge amounts of data that now we could actually do things with.
Yes.
For the longest time, the domain of really good imagery, and it really sort of still is, was within government entities around the world. The US, the NGA, right, has a really good sort of lock on, they really like exquisite imagery, so they can see a bunch of stuff. But what Planet Lab did was to sort of add in a new dimension in terms of what can you do with data that comes from imagery that may not be the perfect and the highest resolution. They looked at if we could see things over time, and now we have data fusion and we have data products able to actually discern what's happening, that becomes interesting to a commercial market as well. So there are a number of things that sort of all came together in the course of maybe 10 years that I think really sort of helped this concept of new space, and that, you know, it was finally coined as a term, right?
And the reason why we met, in fact, was because of Robert Jacobson's book, and he utilized the term new space. And I used many of your quotes as I was preparing for podcasts and videos on on space. And then you appear in there with a set of new concepts. And I want to get back to something that is, you started with your drive for space because either, as you said, is it a blessing or is it not a blessing?
Yeah.
And you worked in this place that is, I'm going to say it has some kind of an aura, DARPA, you know, whatever you would say, and even in Europe, oh, this person worked in DARPA. It's just something unbelievable. Okay, it's a different thing. But I want to move that further ahead. As you built your Arkisys team, how do you one day you're at the university and say, am I done with this? I want to go into doing something different. Was it that, or was it just that you had a drive to build business like probably your grandfather, or how did you say, okay, uni stays behind or college, I'm going to drive into the world of business?
Yeah, no, it's a fair question. DARPA is it's a fascinating sort of managed activity to generate as many ideas and then instantiate them into some sort of prototype for innovations that I've seen, and it's I think we're blessed in the U.S. to have it. You know, it's fascinating to sort of see where it came from. Won't get into that here, but um, the construct of innovation is the construct of ideas is really fascinating. It's as if it's a resource, but it's not owned by any individual. It's not owned by a company. It's not owned by a country. An idea is something that can be created and then move into the ether, and anybody can pick up that idea. The challenge is that to take that idea and then to create something or instantiate it. And so that's how I sort of see the difference between the word idea and innovation. Innovation is actually taking an idea and then making something happen, right? DARPA is a place where I think they recognize that there is there's potential magic in that jump. That and there's no question that there are crazy ideas, and then there are sort of boring ideas, right? There's some mix in there, but the goal is to be able to take one of those ideas and then create an innovative action out of it to actually go support something.
Mhm.
When I was at DARPA, I was able to do some really amazing things. I have to say I was incredibly lucky and blessed to be given the opportunity to create something that is still going today, which is great, right? That's very rare. But the other thing that I noticed, which was interesting, is that, and this is getting to sort of why a company, is that there exists, unfortunately, there exists a number of valleys of death. It's interesting, within the US government in particular, and DARPA is no different, DARPA is a government entity, the way to instantiate an innovation into a product or a prototype or a mission is you have to go through a contract. Just sort of natural, right? And that's the way the money is funded.
Yeah.
The challenge is that at the moment, the entire acquisition system that is within the Department of Defense and in general within the government doesn't allow for really fast and short-lived executions of projects, and it especially doesn't allow for and doesn't even encourage new companies. If you want to do business with the government, you typically have to have, you know, a huge amount of overhead associated with the management, accountability, the accounting office. You have to get it signed off, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing about DoD acquisitions is they're typically centered around not always services, although there are many services that they support. But if you want to build something, there has to be a funding for a mission to build that thing. But what DARPA does is they fill a gap that essentially exists where we think we might have some cool stuff, but we don't have a mission, right? So what do we do? Well, we want to demonstrate that. But it still leaves a gap, especially for new companies or new folks trying to break into the market. The other thing that exists in terms of what I'll call a valley of death is that, as you might imagine, many things in a lot of domains, but space is one of those in particular, has there's a valley of death related to security. So there are many things that we know are dual use. A Volkswagen is both a beautiful family car, but it can also run somebody over, right?
Yes.
So space up until, I don't know, 20 years ago or something, was really seen as only the domain where either very large commercial satellites are supporting telecoms, or it's military satellites, and therefore it's sacrosanct, and you know, it's all national security. No question that the dual use application is an issue that must always be looked at. But what it does is it allows innovators to get right up to a point, and then boom, it might actually, the DoD may actually clamp down to not allow any further innovation, or talk to anybody else that might add to the innovation because it's considered potentially sensitive, right? So you have these various, you know, cliffs that you have to fall off. So what I saw, in all honesty, at sort of the end of DARPA, and this gets to why it was that I felt it was the right time to create a business, is that I saw that in the commercial sector, most especially related to how fast the CubeSat innovation was proliferating in the commercials, that the innovation was moving at a faster pace that was able to somehow get over that valley of death of whether it was security, whether it was not being able to get the funding that came in, that there was the impression, there was investors that were willing to make that jump, to go from idea to creating a little prototype to actually getting to locate it, right? So, and especially in the domain that I truly believe is what I call the second generation of space activities. And that is, it's not just looking at the ground and doing things for the ground, but now it's looking at other spacecraft and doing services for those spacecraft, but in preparation for going out further. Because honestly, you know, it's a reasonable step. So that's part of the reason why I felt, well, okay, I did some amazing things at DARPA. I saw where the limits are. But it seems like the commercial sector is ripe and is doing things in a faster, innovative standpoint. And so that's why I thought, well, I'll go ahead and start a company, maybe take advantage of that.
How did you find your, I'm going to call them mates, or the persons that work with you, or how did you find, because I'll give an example. In my case, when we were building the Jaguar Land Rover plant, this is it's a plant, you build a plant from scratch. My process team had, by definition, I selected two persons instead of 8, 10, 12. But it's very hard, you know. One of them I already knew his work, her work, to be fair. The other one, we took some time to interview, because I had this idea that, man, this is going to be hard. We're going to have 3 time zones working, senior management worried with things that need to be implemented. So I felt that in my case was always more important who than exactly if they were really good at that specific thing. I don't know if that happened to you or not, but can you give an idea for folks that, well, for myself as well, but for learning more, but who is building a company? How did you find your team, and would you do anything with them, or is it just because of space? How did you found the idea of the team?
Yeah, no, that's a good, definitely a fair question. I think the first one is sort of qualifications. I would say that there are sort of two levels of qualifications for a business that's dealing with things in space. The first one is, from a technical standpoint, domain knowledge is important. It really is. Having folks that have put things into space, that understand the basic constructs of creating a platform to be able to withstand the launch, to be able to live in the environment of space, is really important. It's one of my observations that it appears that a lot of the startup companies, especially done by younger individuals, which is great, not a problem, all want to tackle that job as the first thing they get into, whereas the company they wanted to start was related to the information they wanted to get down. So, which, and again, from a cost standpoint, you'd like to do things yourself. You think you can do it cheaper. Okay, that's all great. In my case, I know that there's enough people that have really good domain expertise and knowledge that my belief was it's better to get someone who I don't have to train, don't have to teach, doesn't have to learn, really understands how to do that. So that's sort of one side of the qualification. The other side of the qualification, the one that you asked, which I think is the most interesting, is if I didn't start this business to do something in space, if I wanted to start, carbon reclamation, would I bring them along too, right?
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
absolutely valid. Again, I was lucky enough to have found individuals that fit both of those. I've been lucky enough. Again, I think I started this particular business a little bit later in my own gestation cycle, if you will. So I've been lucky enough to have met a number of folks who I've always thought, hey, I'd really like to do something with this person if we can find the right time, the right place, and sort of all put together. I the individuals that are supporting the company at the moment, I have now known for at least 10 years. So it built up an understanding, a really good sort of relationship with them, if you will, such that, in all honesty, we would all be comfortable saying, forget space, let's go work under the water, right? Because that's going to be fun. We can go lay on beaches or something, right? So if we all get excited about it, that would be the thing. I'd feel comfortable with those people that have the domain skill. The other interesting thing about, in particular, space projects is to execute a space project, it is by definition a systems project.
Yes.
So the cool thing about that is that you can take that systems experience and apply it to almost any other domain, any other platform. So from that standpoint, it's really useful that if we did want to do something else, we could. So that's essentially how we did it. I've known the folks for many years. The other thing that I always wanted to do, and this sort of goes back to the thought about how do we enable smaller businesses to really get started in space, is that because I've been, again, lucky enough to have actually put my hands on hardware enough times that it's sort of satisfying. I feel good about what I've done, but I don't necessarily have to do it again. Instead, what I prefer is to find small companies that would be able to support elements of a larger architecture or potentially an ecosystem that we can continue to grow in space. And those companies are not Lockheed Martin. They're not Ball Aerospace. They're not the really big companies. They're the really small ones that can move fast, that are innovative, and that have done things a little bit different. So that's, from a business standpoint, at least from the first architecture, that's what we've elected to do.
And then, however, okay, you talked about one thing that, and I was in the UK. I was very active in what was called model-based systems engineering group.
Yeah.
And we decided to create guidelines and templates and to go and spread the idea that engineering can be done in a different way, not textual version.
Mm-hmm.
The construct around what models to use and what things were is, I'm going to say, not that relevant, but the whole point of having this, and it is free, okay? It's through INCOSE, the International Council of Systems Engineering.
Yep.
My question is, how are you empowering, or how are you teaching these folks on the new companies that you identify? Are you proposing programs that is, because thinking about systems engineering is not only okay, you follow the systems engineering process, that's fine, but it's more than just the model. It's also the thinking behind. How are you placing those things back into the industry when some folks are too focused on the technology? How have you been doing that? And you are an hardware person, because I listened to a couple of your other interviews and they said, I'm an hardware person. I like hardware. I like to see things working. I like to understand if this doesn't connect with that, what's the cause? And so my question is really, David, with so much thinking, and okay, let me just go back one thing. In the US, I was a bit shocked that the focus on business process management or process management overall is way less than in Europe, at least from my knowledge, okay? I was like, whoa, like process automation and things like that. In here, technology is the focus. The process side stays, oh, we'll sort it out. I was like, I really want to think about the process later. So is this a cultural thing? Is what's happening? I might be completely wrong, but as I walk through industries that are finance, for example, big focus on process and technology. But space is a particular thing. First thing, how do you empower them? What's your thoughts on that? And second, why this non-relation to process?
Yeah, it's a okay. So I'll start with sort of the systems engineering. We have not instantiated a particular model-based process in the company, nor our sort of design activity. At least one that I could say it's in this book on section 3.4, right? I don't know. There's actually there's a number of folks, both in academia as well as the industry, that write books on this all the time. So I've been, I guess my entire training and career has been in very compact, focused, high intensity teams working on complex things to get to a particular milestone. Not, and it's basically trying to prove that things can work each time, making it a little bit better as it goes forward. And we follow the typical, process where you get through the design, and then the big thing that we do, and the thing that we're instantiating into the company, and we're flowing into every other company that's touching us, in all honesty, is the notion that we want to test as early as possible, whether anybody has a fully flight qualified piece of hardware or not. Don't care. If you've got something sitting on the bench and it's laid out in a bunch of components, that's great, man. Let us plug into it and we will start talking to it. The classic V of systems engineering, right? Always there's an iteration that occurs at the bottom of the V, and that's typically where it hits, where now you start to put the hardware together, and now you start to test. Is it doing what you're said to do? Oh my God, it's not. Go back and redesign, right? So our view is, in all honesty, we're testing on the downslope of the V on the left-hand side before we ever get to that point. And the so from a system standpoint, what we're instituting, in all honesty, is we've tried to take the process of of accepting both customers as well as vendors into our business. And the business is the actions of money flow and transactions and validating information. But
Mhm.
to make all that work, you have to have the technical platform.
Mhm.
So as a part of the what we're calling the onboarding process, and this applies to absolutely everybody, we're sending them a very small widget, basically,
Okay.
that allows them to plug into their hardware. It doesn't matter what it is, it makes no difference, that we can then plug into what we call, what I think the industry calls a digital twin.
Okay.
We call it
Okay.
an emulator, that in essence, we start operating that thing before we ever get down to the bottom end. And why are we doing that, right? That's really interesting is that the entire team begins to see a value proposition associated with trying to beat that cycle at the very bottom of going around that you haven't resolved. Oh, we found a problem in the entire operations because we didn't think about that in design process. And I'm sure you've been in it. I've been in many times myself where it ends up being the poor bastards in the integration and test team that have to fix the spacecraft, right?
Yeah. Yes.
So we from my standpoint, that's just such a waste that puts too much stress on people. There's no reason to get to that point. Schedules get blown out of the water. So our view is, oh, we're going to start integrating before we complete the design. Right? I mean, I know it's a little crazy. People are like, dude, why are you doing this? But the fascinating thing is, again, this is sort of a value proposition that has come out related to the advancements in technology, to the point that we have really good computational simulations, that we can run things really quickly, and we can emulate and model real pieces of hardware and the environment almost to the point that you wouldn't know the difference, or at least a piece of hardware wouldn't know the difference. So from that standpoint, you know, the other thing that in honesty we're doing is that entire process, as we're developing it, will flow into when we get into orbit and we start adding things to orbit. The same exact process will happen. So
Oh,
it's
okay.
yeah.
So you you are investing hard on validating first.
Yeah,
It's not even verification; it's validation. To be
it's
fair,
validation. Yeah,
it's
no, that's exactly right. I
uh,
it's
uh,
and in honesty, by doing that really early, the really fascinating thing is that we started this with just a few companies, and now uh, the, and you know, the other thing that's sort of interesting about this is that it's not our goal. It's not my goal to write some book or to give some lectures on this. You know, everybody has a different opinion about how to do it, but we're getting much more interest in other companies and even other government laboratories or other laboratories about the process that we're going through in order to do that. And they're questioning, which is valid. Does this really save you time? That's a valid question. Um, are you inadvertently potentially holding yourself back by doing that and not doing the typical trade studies of different types of mechanisms or components? Valid question. That's good. But from my standpoint, again, I go back to one of the primary premises that I really want to enable is to allow anybody to get into the business of space who
yes.
wishes to get into space.
Mm.
So being able to reach out and touch somebody, even if it's a couple of graduates that just came out of Stanford and they have a small widget on a bench, hey man, we can plug into them. We can then put them into an entire simulation showing if their thing is real, this is how it's going to work, and this is the value proposition it would be as their business. And that would be, I mean, if we can do that, it'd be amazing. So, so that's
Okay.
part of the reason why we're doing it. It's not, yeah, I wish I could tell you that it was
It,
perfectly planned, but it comes
well,
from, honestly, a number of the team members that I've been lucky enough to work with over the past couple of decades, that we've done a lot of hardware work and we see the value and we figured out how can we make that move faster for us.
so that thing needs to be placed out to the world, David, sooner or later, or I don't know what repository you are using or what ways to communicate that, or but that would be a very interesting thing to start writing about if you have not started yet. But that's I've been in the community of Agile Systems Engineering, and this year someone presented something very similar to what you've just shown. I will later share you to this from.
That would be great. Yeah, that'd be
As
great.
they had a very similar approach to what you had, essentially not seeing the V&V, but shifting that, they call it agile, but essentially from the top and it iterates in this direction. So
Yeah.
that was moving something 2D, like we see, correct, to a 3D. And okay, there is something in the bottom that can then percolate to the top. I was like, ooh, okay, there is some notion of how the geometry also affects the way that you think about things.
Yep.
I want to shift gears to something that is this. You are an entrepreneur. What is the practice that you recommend what is your practice as an entrepreneur? That is when you are overwhelmed, when you are working too much or too less, or cannot find things. What is, as an entrepreneur, what is the best practice that you would say, Gonzalo or someone else that are moving into the industry, or Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, because probably needs more help now than anyone, to anyone, what is the best practice that you would say?
Yeah. So this is I once heard that Elon Musk had made the comment that starting a business is one of the most difficult things to do in the world, and I didn't know if I agree or disagree at the time. There's no question that since we are all humans and we literally can't work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, that there's sort of at least two precepts that I've had to learn, I've had to accept. That typical entrepreneurs are very A-type personalities, and so they want to do everything down to the details. We've all heard the stories about Steve Jobs, and amazingly intelligent and creative, but very, very controlling. And part of that's probably the success of Apple as well. So it's there's balances everywhere. But the ones that I've had to work on for a long time. One is letting go of control. So if you have people that you have accepted into your sphere and you've started a company, you have to allow them to go off and execute. And even if that means that you don't agree with every single small thing that they do, the most insidious thing that tends to happen, at least what I've observed, is that the more you micromanage, the less incentive and motivation and creativity the individual has to do things on their own, right? So it's a really tough balance, and so that's letting go of control doesn't mean saying here's a task, best of luck, go do it, but it's really getting into a mind meld about why is that task important and how does it apply to solving the business problem or solving the technical problem or whatever, so that you've communicated as the entrepreneur why that's important, and then you empower them to go off and do it. And whether they do it a different way than what you would have done, but as long as it gets done, hey, that's great, right? So that's one. That is a tough one, right? Is letting go.
Letting go. Yeah, I was thinking about it. Let it go.
Let it go. Yeah. The second one, and this is the other one that I don't know if I have a perfect solution for, but there's no question that I know many others who are in the entrepreneurial world get overwhelmed. And we're still humans. We have families. We have people we want to spend time with. Time is not not a friend of the entrepreneur. There's just no question. There is never enough time to do everything. It's just not possible. So one way to solve that is you give tasks to other people, and that's one way to sort of offload you. But in honesty, it still seems that I'm not able to get everything done. So then I've at least had to come to some resolution that I have to make real-time decisions about what's the most important thing to answer at that time. Almost everything that I have sort of seen is that it doesn't have to be answered in the next 30 seconds. You don't have to answer every single positive email at every time that it comes in, I've had to learn how that you need to keep things going and you need to support the team members. Therefore, there are decisions made in order to support that. So those are important. But then a lot of other things, honestly, I have to reshift priorities almost every single day, and I have to accept that I won't get to them that day. It's difficult because that's also letting go internally as opposed to letting go externally to somebody else. And it's never an easy thing to do. So I am constantly sort of making those decisions in real time about what do I need to focus on, what am I going to leave till tomorrow, what am I going to leave till the next day, and you know that refocus and reshifting of priority happens every day. That's what it is. But it can eat you alive, and it can also keep you sitting at a desk for 14 or 16 hours a day, right? That's the alternative. And yes, no question, there are many days, and I'd spend way more working hours than I care to admit. But I also make sure that I can go, rock climb with my son, or we can go to paintball, or we can go somewhere just to get out. That's sort of the third thing that I suggest. That we hear a lot about using exercise or meditation or some other way to just get yourself away. And I absolutely, totally, and completely agree with that. So at some points, whether it's 4 hours or 8 hours, you got to unplug, because that's the upside of the technology is you're always connected. The downside is you're always connected. So, yeah.
And David, do you have like a personal routine to do these things? It happens in the morning, in the afternoon, or do you have a personal routine for your entrepreneur side, or how does it work?
Yeah, I've always gotten up early, so I tend to I attempt to, if I can get the motivation to go do exercise in the morning. Doesn't always happen, right? But
Right?
I usually get up very early, lay things out from the personal side that I need to make sure that I get done that day. But then, I actually try. Unfortunately, I am I admit it, I'm a sticky junkie. So I
Okay.
have little stickies everywhere, right? Um, there you go. There you go. Yes. So the act of I found that, honestly, just sitting down, the act of writing things out, it takes some of the confusion or the maelstrom of concern about what's happening or should happen today. You put it on a piece of paper. You begin to very, very quickly see, oh wow, number one, I could move to number 10. I don't have to do that. I just thought of that first, but I can move it to number 10. Number 2 is important, 5 is important, so I'm going to move those, and those are the one I'm going to do. So I typically do that every day, and I have lists for personal, for the business, for other activities, and lay them out, right? So that's sort of it.
So you're the list person. Is that it? List or stickies? Is that the method?
It's at least what I use at the moment. I haven't found any other. Again, I maybe because I'm more, again, hardware focused, tactile focused. I like the construct of writing things out, putting on a piece of paper. Yes, I still try to utilize whatever's on the, Outlook or the internet or some other way, but that means that, in all honesty, you have to look at electronics. That's the other thing that is just overwhelming. It's just constant pulse of electronics all the time today, which is sort of our norm. So I find it, I have pieces of paper everywhere that I'm writing things down, right? So that's, anyway, that's how I
I
do it.
wanted to ask you about one thing. As you move through all of these, I'm going to say, really amazing works, have you, how, essentially, was there a failure that you found that set you up for success, or is there a personal failure that you say this was really good? I have one that in my personal history, I failed consulting for the consulting company that I always wanted to consult. I failed, and I went there with already 12 years of experience, ready for everything. I said, this is it. It's going to be awesome. And it wasn't. But it was so good that it wasn't, because it opened me completely different doors later. And this was really like hard. I invested time, money, personal, we put the thing in the curriculum, or you go to an interview and say, oh, you spent here 3 months, what happened? And you have an option. Either you say to the recruiter or to the person in front of you, look, this didn't really work out. And then you don't belong to the ones that need to be chosen, because for some reason people only hire the ones that do everything right. That's kind of an awkward thing in the interviews. Or I just say that, yeah, the funding was over, and oh yes, the funding was over. Then it becomes socially
Right.
accepted. But
Right.
what I'm saying is that do you have any kind of failure that I would say set you up for success, either in personal side or in the space side? And do you care to talk about it?
Yeah, no, it's interesting you mentioned that, because if you take a step back and sort of look at it academically, it's really a failure or a firing or something is an event where the individual or the organization resets. And we hear that word all the time. We are going to reinvent ourselves. Right? It's really, really hard to do that consciously. I think if I wanted to reinvent myself, well, okay, I'm going to do that. Well, we live our lives every day. We come in and do our work every day in a certain way. Could I break my writing of the list, right? Is that holding me back in some way? Well, I'm going to reinvent. Well, I always come back to the list, right? So that I'm just refer that because I find it fascinating that people always talk about reinventing or resetting, but they never really do it. But those that have failures or that are fired do. And my postulation is that it's a reset that was forced upon you, that then really sort of woke you up in a way that you can't do it yourself or your coworkers can't do it for you, right? So yes, the one that it comes to my mind is the most crystal clear. Um, it's both incredibly painful and one of the greatest successes I think I've ever had. The one thing I'm most proud of the team that did it. I was fired
Okay.
long time ago when I was working at the Air Force Research Lab, or Air Force Rocket Propulsion Laboratory, the real rocket propulsion laboratory. Personality issues, maybe immaturity on I'm not sure what it was. Either way, I was fired. And when I was fired, I wasn't like thrown out, but I was exiled to a test site. So I was taken off a major project that I really wanted to be on, and I was very, very excited about, but nope, you can't do that. You're going to move up here to this test site. So after licking the wounds, personally for a while, um, it opened up for me an amazing set of opportunities and eventually an idea that I was able to convince the management, convince folks back in DC that we eventually did one of the coolest tests that I've ever been part of. I got to meet Apollo astronauts, Apollo
Okay.
mission directors. I got to meet the Vice President of the United States. All of that came from being fired. It was fascinating, and so that's why I think about that all the time. What allowed me to do that? And I don't know that I can say. It's just that it was a shock to my psychological system, and it sort of washed away whatever concerns that I had, whatever the problem that I was having with the management at the time, or whatever they were having with me, whatever it was, right? It it just sort of pushed all that aside, and it allowed me to basically start clean, start fresh. And at that point, it's like, clouds lifted and you began to see these, well, okay, I'm here. This is what we do. What really cool thing could I do? right? And then talking to some folks, and then it all finally came together. So and you hear that all the time where people, I mean, I can even tell you that I'm sure she'll be okay, but my sister and her husband was working for a company, and they were both fired. When they were fired, they started their own business. They have now grown and outpaced the previous business they were working for because they were fired. So it's, I don't know if, honestly, I don't know if everybody is up for, everybody should get fired once, right? You hear that all the time. But you asked the word failure. I see that as being fired as a personal failure, and I tried to turn that around. So that's.
I'll tell you something that happened because of our transition, me and my wife, between Portugal, Norway, Spain, US.
Oh, wow.
Essentially, we change countries every 4 years, okay? So,
okay.
And so when we arrive to a new country, it's like, oh, okay, let's find a job. Let's find everything. And the reason why I'm saying this is the following, David. And how do you see, and I think you've touched on that, at a certain moment in any company, that necessity of change should appear. And I've been thinking about this for a long time, because when you are starving, you find food. That's it. You will, when you don't have money in the bank, you'll find a way to get. But it's very hard to say to your brain that you don't have something that you have. And for an entrepreneur or someone that is a bit more far along the scale of a company that is working, man, David, how do you bring that necessity?
Yeah,
and
that's
the domain of space.
Yeah.
Especially in the domain of space. How to do that? Because that's beyond the V&V, but it's definitely the last V part. How do you? Do you have a practice for that, or it's an open question? Since you alluded to that, I was like, let me see.
Yeah, no. So what's one of the precepts at DARPA, which I think enables more opportunities or a higher probability of magic to occur, is that whoever goes into DARPA, it's sort of like the movie Logan's Run. You have a clock. You are given a badge when you come into the DARPA that has your expiration date on it from the day you walk in the door. So you already know you only have so much time remaining. The interesting thing about that is that it does a couple of things. It focuses the individual's mind to, and again, they typically bring folks into DARPA that push really hard, right? They don't just bring somebody who just wants to sit there and do nothing, right? So it pushes that person to do as much as practical possible. And the interesting thing about that is, you're always thinking, and I can tell you this because I went through it, you're always thinking about, how do I shortcut this? How do I bypass that? How do I get this done when I know these people or this organization doesn't want me to do it? How do I go around them, right? It's a sort of fascinating process. Now, I don't mean in a bad way, right? That's not what I mean, but it focuses the mind to get as much done as possible as quickly. The other thing that it does is that the incentive for the people around you, they don't survive unless you succeed. So there's an incredible incentive for all of them, the contractors, the consultants, the seat of support, the executive office. It doesn't matter who it is. Everybody is there to try to do that. It's a tough environment because it's very, very fast paced. So there is quite a bit of turnover in the support because it's a lot of stress, right? But the other thing that it does, in all honesty, what I think is that it automatically resets one of those offices every 4 years. And I say that because when one person goes in and they get as much done and then they leave, you have another person that comes in. That person guaranteed doesn't have the same viewpoint as the person that's left, even about the project that they might think is cool, but they might want to go in a different direction. So by definition, they're almost automatically resetting. Now, I would argue that in some cases, that's inefficient
Mm,
because some projects or prototypes take a longer gestation cycle than just moving out, right? That's okay.
yeah,
But you're asking about a company, right? How do
yeah.
you do that in a company? Because in essence, the company is meant to last for a long time.
Yes.
And that's opposite of very sort of cycles of innovation that occurs, right?
So exactly,
So
I'm looking for that. How do we build necessity for survival when,
yeah,
for example, you already have a grant or you already have something working? It's working,
yeah,
it's okay.
yeah, yeah,
And I've seen that although in the world of process management, okay is good, the process is under control. It's terrible for innovation. It's terrible for growth.
yeah,
And,
yeah,
and
yeah,
and my friends from Lean Six Sigma might kill me, but I've seen this happen over and over again in a plant where everything is regular. Over time, the quality decreases massively because you no longer have better ways to avoid waste and things like that.
yep,
But it
yeah,
kills the brain.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So how do
Well,
you bring that necessity? That's what
yeah,
I
yeah. So that's that there's no question that's a valid point. So I don't know. I if you look at sort of some of the um, if you just look at some of the more notorious, if I use that word, entrepreneurs that we hear about or read about and things that they've done, um, that they always seem to be pushing things very hard. Um, from what I've heard, Elon Musk does that to even his own folks, right? And he's constantly challenging folks how to lower the cost, lower the time required, do it better, do it fast, whatever it is, right? He's constantly doing that. Um, I don't know if there's a formal process that's in place, but that's one method. Another one that I've seen and I've been thinking about is that from the very beginning, um, I've thought about that even starting a business and we have one particular step that is already in some way disruptive or in some way innovative, but I've already got to start thinking about what's the next one. And you don't voice it at the time.
okay.
You have, but you have a timeline that you will introduce it into the business, even if it means, and this to me, this is one of the more fascinating things that may happen, is that when a business gets going and it's successful and it's stable, nobody likes to change things.
Yeah.
That's they don't, right?
Uh,
So that means, unfortunately, someone has to be the disruptor. If you're lucky enough to be the CEO and you own 51%, you can disrupt. You may or may not keep the same people. They may or may not survive if you disrupt too much, right? But that's one process.
okay.
The other one that's interesting that I truly hope that I can implement is that the idea of DARPA. The timeline is intriguing, and how would you bring that into a company? The only way, not the only way, but one way that I've thought about it that I would love to explore, in all honesty, is in the BD department. And we always think about BD as business development, but from my standpoint, that's not what I would like an individual or a group to do if I brought them in a department. My department would be called the Business Disruption Department. So its sole job, and in all honesty, would be you're not going to have a job for the rest of your life in this location or in this company. I'm going to give you this much money and this much time. That's all you have. Your job is to disrupt everything that we're doing. That's your job. So it's got it because you have to assume that disruption is just we don't like it. We argue against it all the time. We say that we need change, but then we don't want to change, right? So DARPA's model is interesting because they built it in. It's been accepted. Yes, I was bummed like heck that I finally had to leave because I was just to the point that things were moving and I was getting it going. It was like son of a, but that's okay, right? That's the way it was. I accepted it. That's the way we're going to go. So honestly, I think the same thing has to happen. And the poor, I don't want to say it. I think they're going to be. It may actually be a completely new career path, but the first a couple of poor bastards that are the real business disruptors in our company, they're going to get stuff thrown at them all the time, right? Those guys are crazy. Throw them out the door. What are they doing, right? And the CEOs, well, they got some good ideas. We might want to bring it in, right? So I mean that is a really valid question. So the interesting thing about space is, how do you disrupt in space when space is, first of all, technically difficult to sort of maintain, but then the other thing about space, and the thing that honestly we really have to think about, and I use the word we as a collective we to the entire industry that is dealing with space today, is that notwithstanding what some country might want to label it as, but it really is it's a global common environment that we all have to work within. So one action by one group affects everybody else because of the domain that we're in. So what that means is, whereas on the ground, you could test out crazy stuff inside your building, and if you blew your building up, okay, well, whatever, you got insurance, you can pay for it. You didn't bust anybody else's stuff, right? In space, if things go awry up there and you start releasing things, now you're affecting other folks. So there's a really interesting balance that has to go there about disrupting business actions and activities that are dealing with how do we deal with Earth-based things related to space, and disruptions of a technical sort that we would try new things in space. So I both can be done. It's just we have to think a little bit more cogently about it when we get into the domain.
I'm going to shift gears to something. Are there some specific books, authors, people, events that you would recommend that helped you, or that keep on helping you in your day-to-day, or important? I read Cosmos many years ago, and for me it was really an important book. I also read the Encyclopedia of Joe Gold. That was an amazing book. That's mind-blowing.
Yeah.
But it doesn't need to be. What is your advice on these type of things?
Yeah. So I have one that has inspired me, but it's probably in different ways, and it may be a little bit different. So I really resonated with the book Freakonomics. That was written by
Stefan Letts?
to the economists, but and the reason that I still remember a lot of their examples is that the way they came at looking at economics, and how and a butterfly's wings in New York affects the trading floor of China, right? And they actually flowed that all the way through. I thought was really, really interesting. And from my standpoint, in thinking about, and again, lucky enough to have done some really cool things throughout my career, I sort of took that as a methodology by which to create new thought processes to come up with innovations in space. So as an example, they always showed that there was links between various actions and behaviors of individuals that translated into economics in a different arena, and yet they were linked, right? So what I've tried to do is to take inspiration from as many other potential domains or functions or actions on the ground in the terrestrial environment that we might be able to apply in space, and then ask the question why or why not. The big one for me as an example is using biology to inspire what we can do in space and how that might change things. So at DARPA, I really got into the notion of biologically inspired cellular systems. And that's the thing that sort of inspired the concept behind satellites. It was actually, there were previous folks that had thought about this. There were folks from Japan that had talked about how to cellularize a space platform into different aggregated systems. There were ground-based. There was a toy manufacturer in Colorado that had actually created something called cubelets. I'm not sure if they're still in business, but they were very cool. So I bought a whole bunch of them and we played with them on the ground, but each one did an independent thing, but it would work together if you put them together. And that was a different approach. And if you change the orientation, it would change how it worked. Dr. Lisa Hill had actually done some work previously at TRW that laid the groundwork that showed that was possible. So there was a number of people that sort of had considered that, but we had never really tied it to what would it do in space, and then how does it translate back to something on Earth that we show really positive attributes from it. So that was, that's not directly tied to economics in terms of the Freakonomics. But I have to tell you that I did give a presentation while I was at DARPA that was called Space Freakonomics. And I specifically tried to tie economics of what happens on the ground into things on space and why the crazy ideas I was coming up with would have merit, right? So.
And David, in the last 3 years, let's put this brief, is there something weird that you started to believe, something that you dropped that was completely different from 3 years ago? What kind of thing that you say, this has really changed for me? And it could be anything, okay? Just an idea of how did you, if you had changed any of these things, what did you do?
That's a good question. I'm not sure if anything's changed. I think maybe it's, well, Kranz wrote the book, Failure is Not an Option. Everybody's heard about it, right? And one of the things that it actually started before I even went back to DARPA, it started at USC, is this notion that we can't fail. And over the years, I've finally come to the conclusion that, in honesty, there is magic in failure, and we just talked about that. What it does to the soul when something fails, right? It crashes, doesn't work, whatever. It's like a cleansing that occurs. I don't know how to explain it, but I've sort of come to the belief that, and especially in dealing with students, that for them to experience failure is probably far more cogent than being told and seeing things work the first time, because it's that, again, it's that visceral feeling that somehow gets into your soul, that when you fail, especially that you want something to work, but when it fails, something happens, and it strengthens you. I truly believe that in some way, that when you go at it next time, you've already learned, you've hopefully learned from something, and you do it a little bit better. So honestly, in the last couple of years, and truly, it flowed into the business and our discussion about sort of testing along the lower V as it comes down, is that I see that as a very positive attribute as opposed to a negative. Anyway, I don't know if that answers the question.
It's an interesting, that shift of perspectives. As we start preparing to close, do you have a space hack? What's Dave space hack? How do you think that space could be different, and how do you get there?
Oh well, the one that really gets me, that I constantly dream about, is that I want to grow a spacecraft. I want a biological element to be able to create a structure and grow in space. So, I mean, this is not a new concept. If you go, I forget what the science fiction, there's a science fiction show that has a living spacecraft where they
Yes.
talk to it all the time. I'm not quite to that point, right? But
Okay.
the idea, again, that on Earth we have this most amazing set of life force that is around us all the time, whether it's bushes or plants or trees, moss, grass, all kinds of animals, that many of them have the capacity to live in really, really harsh environments. There is no reason why we cannot translate that into space to have the element that will house us eventually actually be part of, you know, the platform that we live within. There's no reason why it can't be that way. So yeah, I don't know if it's a hack as much as a sort of a crazy dream out there that we'd like to get to, right? So, but yeah, the concept of expanding our view of what biology does on this Earth to allow us to travel great distances or live in space, because right now all of the stuff we put into space is this metal, clunky, cornered things, right? It's just so Cro-Magnon, right? We want to be fluid. We want to be, you know, very open, very, I mean, I love the human body is one of the most amazing things. So is all sort of animals and trees. And how do we get that and translate to actually grow in space? So anyway.
That's a fantastic idea.
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
do you have any departing words for folks that will listen? What would you like to say to?
Yeah, no. Uh, I actually, you know, every generation says this is the most exciting generation. You know, I remember the quote from Russell Crowe in Master and Commander when he was looking at the design of the big boat, and you know, and how it was long and sleek, and we live in a most fascinating and wonderful, innovative time, right? And this was back in the 1800s, right? So, but I honestly, what I see is we are literally at a cusp point in the use of space. I truly believe that we are now going beyond sending up things into orbit that we know will fail, and we have to spend so much time to design it on the ground, to now we're going to have companies, we're going to have capabilities on orbit to truly be able to refuel, to reservice, to build things, to repair things, that honestly is going to open up what I like to refer to as undiscovered markets. We still don't know all of the amazing things we're going to be able to do once we enable all of this sort of servicing activity in space until we get there. And to me, that's the most exciting thing, because in honesty, those kinds of things are going to inspire all of the young people behind us that are going to look up and say, wow, that's now possible. I wonder if you could do this. And boom, now we have small businesses, mom and pop shops, you know, things that we'd really like to evaluate and create for new companies to get going into space, because we're going to have these capabilities that heretofore have not existed. And to me, that's absolutely fascinating, because honestly, that's our next step. That's our next step off this planet, is to be able to do this in space. So that I'm really excited about. So yes, I think this is the most exciting generation in space as we sit here today. Yes.
David, thank you very much. I'm sure. Well, first of all, as we got talking and I've seen in other things, you are really much more exciting when you are excited. So
Yes.
in terms
Yes.
of when
Yes.
And you guys have an outstanding idea for Arkisys, but I would say that your views on bringing this economy from here up there, it's just, David,
Yeah.
it's amazing.
It's possible. It's all possible. If we, you know, the only impediment is going to be us, you know, if we, either governments or regulations or whatever. And that's why it's important, why the industry that we're all sort of in, while yes, we're competing, honestly, I look at this first initiation and step out into space very similar to, you can sort of think of it as similar to the, have you seen the show called Deadliest Catch? Where in essence, Deadliest Catch is all about North Sea fishermen that
Okay.
go after king crab. And it's
Oh,
a really nasty place out there in the North Sea, right? And they have
yes.
these big boats and they have these crews. It's very, very dangerous. It's very competitive. But the most interesting thing about that is that's a domain that very few will venture into. And if any one of those fishermen ever gets into distress in those boats, everybody drops what they're doing. They're no longer competing, and they go and they help those individuals because it's a harsh environment. So I tend to think that, in honesty, all of the space industry folks have to some level have to think that way. And the thinking is not necessarily going and helping a spacecraft that may be in trouble, but it's thinking ahead to make sure that we're not going to cause debris, we're not going to cause disruption by new innovations that we all want to do, but we're mindful of that. And that, in essence, is helping us to work in this domain to make sure that more businesses can get out there and open things up. So,
Yeah,
so that's, yeah, that's sort of how I think.
that's brilliant.